My name is Claire Whitfield, and I'm 34 years old. 3 days before Christmas, my father called me at 6:42 in the evening while I was still in my work clothes, standing in my kitchen with a pot of soup on the stove. His voice was flat, rehearsed, the way people sound when they've said the same sentence out loud to themselves before they dial. He said, "Claire, we're canceling dinner this year. Everyone's staying home. The weather's too bad to drive." I looked out my window. The sky was clear, not a single flake on the ground. I asked him if he was serious, and he said, "Don't make this difficult," and hung up before I could answer. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a photo my cousin Renee didn't mean to send to the wrong group chat. It showed my father's dining room, the good china out, my stepmother lighting candles, my half-brother Tyler already at the table. The caption read, "She has no idea." I sat down on my kitchen floor and didn't move for a long time. Before I tell you what I did next and why my father ended up losing far more than a dinner invitation, tell me what time it is where you are right now, and where in the world you're watching this from. If you've ever been the one left out of a room you helped build, stay with me, and don't forget to subscribe because this family was about to learn that silence isn't the same as surrender. Before I go further, let me tell you a little about who I was before any of this started, because it matters for what comes later. I grew up in a house 2 streets from a small lake, in a town where everyone knew everyone's business within a week of it happening. My mother taught piano lessons out of our living room. My father sold insurance and later became a partner at a small accounting firm downtown, the kind of business where his name was on a brass plate by the front door, and people trusted him because his handshake was firm and his shirts were always pressed. I used to think that meant something about who he was underneath. I've since learned that a firm handshake and a pressed shirt tell you nothing at all about a person's honesty. I want to take you back before that phone call, because none of what happened at Christmas was really about Christmas. It was about a pattern that started when I was 9 years old, the year my mother died, and my father remarried a woman named Denise within 14 months. I remember standing in the doorway of my old bedroom watching movers carry my mother's reading chair out to a donation truck, while Denise stood in the hallway telling me it was time to make room for the new family. I didn't say anything. I learned early that saying something made things worse. When I was 11, Denise gave birth to Tyler, and I watched my father's attention narrow to a single point of light that never included me again. I still went to every dinner. I still sent the birthday cards. I still showed up early to help set the table, because some part of me believed that if I was useful enough, quiet enough, easy enough, I would eventually be counted as one of them. There were 3 moments in my life before that Christmas call where I surrendered instead of speaking. The first was at 16, when Denise accidentally used my college fund savings bond to pay for Tyler's travel soccer league, and my father told me to let it go because family helps family. I let it go. The second was at 26, when I paid off $11,000 of my father's credit card debt after he told me the bank was going to take the house, and Denise later told a neighbor at a barbecue that the house had never actually been at risk. I found out and said nothing. The third was 4 years ago when my grandmother, my father's own mother, passed away and left behind a modest but real estate, a house on Cedar Lane worth around $400,000, and a trust account worth close to $200,000, meant to be split evenly between my father and his sister, my Aunt Pauline, with a portion set aside specifically for me, her only grandchild, because I was the one who drove 2 hours every weekend, for the last 3 years of her life to sit with her, manage her medications, and handle her paperwork. My grandmother trusted me enough to name me as a co-trustee on that account, alongside my father, specifically so that no single person could move money without a second signature. She told me privately, "I don't trust your father with money," when Denise is in the room. I didn't understand the weight of that sentence until this year. I remember the day she said it clearly because it was raining and I had brought her a thermos of the tomato soup she liked, and she was sitting in her recliner with a blanket over her knees, her hands thin and spotted but still steady when she held mine. She told me she had watched Denise count things at every family gathering, watched her eyes move across the furniture and the jewelry box on the dresser like she was doing inventory. My grandmother wasn't a wealthy woman by most standards, but she was careful, and careful people notice when someone else is doing math in a room that isn't theirs to calculate. She made me promise that whatever happened after she was gone, I would look at the paperwork myself and not simply trust that my father would handle it the way he should. At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious, the way older people sometimes are about money. I didn't understand until much later that she wasn't being cautious. She was being accurate. The moment I decided no more wasn't the Christmas phone call. It was 3 days earlier when I received a courier envelope at my apartment by mistake. It was addressed to my father, but delivered to me because our old family address had been auto-filled from a shared account we once used for my grandmother's medical bills. Inside was a letter from Whitmore and Cole, an estate law firm, referencing a trust document titled Amendment to Beneficiary Designation, with my grandmother's name on it, dated 2 months after she had died. I read that sentence 4 times before it made sense. A document dated after her death. I remember sitting very still at my kitchen table, my hands cold, staring at a page that should not have existed. I didn't call my father. I didn't call Denise. I made a decision that would define the next several weeks of my life. I decided that I would not react with emotion. I would react with evidence. If my family had learned to rely on my silence, they had never once had to reckon with my attention to detail, and that was about to become a very expensive mistake for them. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse records office in the county where my grandmother's estate had been filed. I requested copies of every document associated with the trust, going back 3 years. I paid the small fee, sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, and read every page twice. What I found didn't shock me the way the courier letter had because by then I was expecting it, but it still made my stomach tighten. There were 2 withdrawal requests from the trust account, each for just under $10,000 submitted 8 months apart, both bearing what was supposed to be my signature as co-trustee. I had never signed either one. I compared them, side by side with an old rental lease I still had, one with my real signature on it. The forged version leaned the wrong direction on the capital W. My real signature never does that. It was close enough to fool a bank teller glancing at it for 6 seconds, but not close enough to fool me, and definitely not close enough to fool a forensic document examiner, which I would soon hire. Before I went any further, I sat with the discomfort of what I now knew for almost 2 full days, because I wanted to be sure I wasn't reacting out of hurt feelings dressed up as suspicion. I went back through old emails from the years I'd helped my grandmother with her bills, cross-referencing account numbers, statement dates, and the names of anyone who had ever had access to her accounts. I found that Denise had been added as an authorized user on one of my grandmother's checking accounts 18 months before she passed, something I had never been told about and something my grandmother, based on a note I found in her address book, had apparently tried to reverse only weeks before her death, writing callbank, remove D from act, in her small, careful handwriting. She never got the chance. I photographed that page of the address book and added it to the folder, because even a handwritten reminder in a dead woman's address book can become evidence when you know how to present it properly. I want to be clear about something. I did not go to my father's house and confront him. I did not call Denise screaming. I did not post anything online. Instead, I opened a folder on my laptop and named it Cedar Lane. Inside that folder, I began building a timeline. I requested the bank's own signature verification records through a formal written request, which by law they had to provide to me as a listed co-trustee. I requested the metadata from the amendment document sent by Whitmore and Cole, which showed it had been created and printed on a specific date, using a specific office computer 6 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. I found 3 text messages Renee had accidentally screenshotted and forwarded to me months earlier, thinking they were funny, in which Denise had written to my father, "Just get Claire's name off it before she starts asking questions. She never checks anything anyway." I saved every message with its timestamp intact. I hired an attorney named Marcus Delgado, who specialized in trust and estate disputes. I remember sitting in his office, sliding the folder across the desk, and watching his eyebrows rise slightly as he flipped through page after page. He told me something I've thought about many times since. He said, "Most people come in here angry and empty-handed. You came in here calm and full. That's the difference between someone who wins and someone who just feels better for a week." I told him I didn't want to fight. I wanted the truth documented, and I wanted whatever belonged to me protected. He nodded and said, "Then let's do this the boring way. Boring wins." Marcus explained the process to me in plain terms that afternoon, sitting back in his chair with his hands folded. He said fraud cases involving family estates rarely get resolved through confrontation, because confrontation gives the accused party a chance to perform, to cry, to reframe themselves as the wounded, one in front of witnesses. What actually resolves these cases, he said, is a documentation trail so complete and so dated that there's nothing left to argue about. He asked me to bring him everything, no matter how small it seemed, every email, every screenshot, every bank statement I could legally access as a listed co-trustee. He told me not to delete a single text message, even the ones that felt embarrassing or petty, because sometimes the smallest details end up mattering the most in front of a judge or a mediator. I spent that weekend organizing 3 years of financial history into a single spreadsheet, color-coded by category, with every transaction date lined up against known family events, birthdays, the funeral, holidays, so that the pattern would be undeniable to anyone who looked at it with fresh eyes. Over the following 2 weeks, we filed a formal request with the Trust's bank for a fraud investigation into the 2 unauthorized withdrawals. We submitted the forged signatures to a certified document examiner, who confirmed within 4 business days that the signatures were not a match to my known handwriting, with a formal written report to support it. We subpoenaed the law firm's file for the amendment document, and their own internal records showed the request had come from my father's email account, sent 9 days after the funeral, asking them to clean up the paperwork since my daughter isn't really involved in this anymore. I read that line standing in my kitchen and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, the way a room goes quiet right before you understand you're not imagining something anymore. Marcus also brought in a forensic accountant named Priya Anand, who specialized in tracing fund movement across personal and trust accounts. She worked through bank statements line by line, flagging a pattern that even I hadn't fully pieced together on my own. The first forged withdrawal, for $9,800, landed in a joint account belonging to my father and Denise, exactly 4 days before a payment was made toward a home renovation loan on their house, a sunroom addition Denise had been posting about online for months, captioning the photos, finally treating myself. The second forged withdrawal, for the same amount just under the reporting threshold that would have triggered additional bank scrutiny, was transferred out in 2 separate cash withdrawals within a week, matching almost exactly the down payment amount later paid for Tyler's car. Priya's report laid all of this out in a clean, numbered timeline, each transaction tied to a specific date, a specific account, and a specific downstream purchase. Reading it felt like watching a puzzle I had lived inside for years suddenly resolve itself into a picture I could finally see whole. While this was happening, life at home continued as if nothing was wrong. My father called twice, casual, asking about my work schedule, mentioning nothing about the trust. Denise posted a photo online of Tyler's new car, a car I now understood, from the bank records, had been purchased 3 weeks after the second forged withdrawal, in cash. I didn't comment. I didn't like the post. I simply took a screenshot and added it to the folder, because a paper trail doesn't care about your feelings, and neither did I need it to. Then came the Christmas call. Everyone's staying home. The weather's too bad. A lie so small and so unnecessary that it almost made me laugh, except it told me everything I needed to know about how little they thought I noticed. They weren't just hiding a dinner from me. They were hiding a life from me, one they had been quietly building on money that wasn't fully theirs to spend, one where my presence had become inconvenient because my presence meant paperwork, and paperwork meant questions, and questions meant the forged signatures might eventually be found. The family group chat, the one I was technically still in but rarely used, lit up that same night with photos from the dinner I supposedly wasn't important enough to attend. Aunt Pauline, my grandmother's daughter, was in that chat too, and she wasn't there for the dinner either. She texted me privately around 9 that evening. Did they cancel on you too? I got the same weather excuse. I told her I had something I needed to show her and asked if we could talk in person. She agreed immediately. I met Aunt Pauline 2 days later at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. I brought the folder. I laid it out slowly, document by document, the way Marcus had taught me to present it. No adjectives, no accusations, just dates and numbers and signatures side by side. I watched her face change as she understood what she was looking at. She had been a co-beneficiary of the estate too, and the same amendment that quietly reduced my share had also reduced hers, redirecting a larger percentage toward my father, and, through him, toward Denise and Tyler. She sat back in her chair and said one sentence I will never forget. He used our mother's death as an opportunity. Neither of us cried. We just started making a list of who needed to be contacted next. Aunt Pauline told me something that afternoon that filled in a piece of the puzzle I hadn't had before. She said that in the weeks after the funeral, my father had called her twice asking her to sign a document just to simplify the paperwork, and both times she had put him off, telling him she wanted her own attorney to review anything before she signed it. She said he'd sounded irritated both times, pushing gently but persistently, and eventually he stopped calling about it altogether. She hadn't thought much of it until now. She also told me she had noticed Denise wearing a ring at a family gathering the previous spring that looked remarkably like one our grandmother used to wear, and when she'd asked about it, Denise had laughed and said it was just something similar she'd found online. We added that detail to the folder too, not because a ring alone proved anything, but because Marcus had taught me that patterns are built from small, unremarkable things, stacked carefully on top of each other until they can no longer be explained away as coincidence. With Aunt Pauline now formally aligned as a co-complainant, our attorney filed a petition with the probate court to freeze the remaining trust assets pending investigation and to formally challenge the amendment document as fraudulent, citing the forensic handwriting report, the email metadata from the law firm, and the bank's own fraud department findings, which by that point had confirmed the withdrawal signatures did not match any signature on file for me as co-trustee. The court granted an emergency freeze on the account within 5 business days. My father did not find out immediately, neither did Denise. I wanted the truth to arrive through official channels, not through me, because I had learned by then that when facts arrive wrapped in documents, people can't argue with them the way they can argue with a daughter's raised voice. The first sign that something had shifted came through Renee again, who texted me a screenshot of a call log showing my father had spent 40 minutes on the phone with the law firm the morning the freeze notice arrived. Then Denise called me directly, something she almost never did. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it, tight and fast. "Claire, there's some kind of mistake with the account. The bank is saying it's frozen. Do you know anything about this?" I kept my voice level. I said, "I know everything about it, actually. You should probably talk to your husband about the amendment he had drafted 6 weeks after his mother's funeral." There was a long silence on the line. Then she hung up. My father called an hour later. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 4 minutes long, and I listened to it twice, once for the words, once for the tone underneath them. He said I was overreacting, that it was just a small adjustment, that Denise had needed help with some bills, that Tyler was practically family too, that I was always looking for reasons to feel left out. Not once in 4 minutes did he say the word forgery. Not once did he say he was sorry. I saved that voicemail with the rest of the folder. 2 days later, Denise tried a different approach. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, standing on my doorstep in her coat with her arms crossed against the cold, asking to come in and talk this through like adults. I stood in the doorway and told her I was happy to talk, but only through our attorneys, because I had learned the hard way that conversations in this family tended to get remembered differently by different people afterward, and I preferred everything from this point forward to exist in writing. She told me I was being dramatic, that this was tearing the family apart, that I should think about what Tyler would say if he knew I was trying to take his car. I told her Tyler's car had already been purchased with money that wasn't legally available to spend, and that fact existed whether or not I ever said a word about it. She left without saying goodbye, and her tires spun slightly on the wet pavement as she pulled away, the only part of that whole visit that felt honestly emotional to me. Marcus had scheduled a formal mediation meeting at his office for the following week, the kind of meeting where all parties, their attorneys, and a neutral mediator sit at the same table and go through the findings together. I want to walk you through that room, because it's the moment everything changed. The conference room had a long oak table, a window overlooking a parking garage, and a pitcher of water no one touched. My father arrived first, wearing his good coat, the one he used to wear to church on the years we still went as a family. Denise arrived beside him, her heels loud on the tile floor, her chin lifted the way it always was when she wanted a room. To know she wasn't afraid. Aunt Pauline sat beside me. Marcus sat across from my father's attorney, a younger man who looked like he had been handed this case that morning and hadn't had time to read the full file. The mediator opened with a summary of the claim. My father cut in almost immediately, saying this was a family matter that had been blown out of proportion, that I had always been sensitive about money since my mother passed, that this was really about hurt feelings, not fraud. I let him finish. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't interrupt. When he was done, Marcus simply slid 3 documents across the table one at a time and let them speak. The first was the forensic handwriting report, with both signatures enlarged side by side, the direction of the W circled in red by the examiner. My father glanced at it and looked away quickly. The second was the email from his own account to Whitmore and Cole, the one where he wrote that his daughter wasn't really involved in this anymore, sent 9 days after the funeral. Denise's face lost color when she read it because it was clear from the wording that he hadn't told her he was writing it either. I watched her hand tighten around the edge of the table, her knuckles going pale, and I understood in that moment that whatever partnership existed between them had never been built on full honesty even with each other, only on a shared willingness to look the other way when it benefited them both. The third was the bank's fraud department letter, confirming both withdrawal signatures had been formally rejected as non-matching, with the transaction dates lining up precisely with the purchase of Tyler's car, evidence Marcus had pulled directly from the dealership's own sales record through a subpoena. I spoke only once during that meeting, and I kept it short. I said, "I'm not here because I'm heard about a dinner. I'm here because you forged my signature to take money from an estate meant to protect all of us equally, and then you lied to my face on the phone about the weather rather than admit I wasn't. Invited to my own family's holiday. I have every date. I have every document. I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking the court to correct the record." The room was silent except for the low hum of the ceiling lights. My father did not answer. Denise stared at the table. Tyler, who had been asked to attend as a listed recipient of some of the funds, sat with his arms crossed and said nothing at all, though I noticed his jaw was tight the entire time. My father's attorney asked for a short recess before responding. Further, and when the meeting resumed 20 minutes later, his tone had changed considerably. He no longer used the word overreacting. He asked instead what it would take to resolve this quietly, a phrase Marcus later told me was almost always code for wanting to avoid a criminal referral. Marcus responded calmly that resolution wasn't about quiet, it was about accuracy, and that the trust needed to be restored to its original terms, regardless of how loudly or softly that happened. My father looked at me across the table then, the first time he had looked directly at me since the meeting started, and for a moment I thought he might actually say something honest. Instead, he said, "You always did keep score, Claire." I answered, without raising my voice. I said, "No, I just kept records. There's a difference, and you're the one who taught me why it matters, back when you told me to always keep my receipts." He didn't respond to that. The mediator recommended immediate resolution rather than a drawn-out trial, given the strength of the documentation, and within 3 weeks a formal settlement was reached. The forged amendment was voided by the court. The frozen trust funds were restored to their original distribution, including my full share and Aunt Pauline's full share. My father was required to repay the withdrawn funds, plus interest, and because forensic evidence confirmed deliberate forgery rather than a simple accounting error, the matter was referred by the probate court to the district attorney's office for review of possible criminal fraud charges, a process that was, as of the time of this telling, still working its way through the system. The financial cost to my father was significant, but it wasn't the largest cost he paid. Word travels fast in a small town, and the fact that a man had forged his own daughter's signature to redirect his deceased mother's estate became something people at the hardware store and the church coffee hour talked about in lowered voices. He had spent decades building a reputation as a reliable church-going man. That reputation didn't survive contact with a public court filing. His longtime business partner in the small accounting firm he co-owned quietly bought him out over the following months, citing concerns about shared client trust, which everyone understood without needing it spelled out. Denise, who had built her own small social standing on hosting dinners and posting photos of a family that looked whole from the outside, found her invitations to community events thinning out. Tyler's car, the one purchased with withdrawn trust funds, was eventually surrendered as part of the repayment settlement. Tyler texted me once, weeks after everything was finalized, a short message that read, "I didn't know where the money came from, I swear." I believed him, honestly. He was 22 and he had grown up in a house where things simply appeared, where explanations were never expected because they were never offered. I told him I didn't blame him for accepting a gift he'd been told was legitimate. I told him I hoped he'd ask more questions going forward about everything, not just money. He didn't respond after that, and I understood why. Being the child who benefited without asking is its own kind of complicated grief, even if it isn't. The same as being the one who forged the signature. I didn't celebrate any of that. I want to be honest with you about that part, because it would be easy to end a story like this with triumph, and that isn't quite the truth. When the settlement was finalized, I didn't feel joy. I felt something quieter, something closer to relief, the kind you feel when you finally put down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. The following spring, I drove out to Cedar Lane for the first time since the settlement, to walk through the house that was now formally, legally mine to co-manage with Aunt Pauline as originally intended. I stood in my grandmother's old kitchen, the one where she used to let me crack eggs into a bowl when I was small, and I noticed the quiet. Not an empty quiet, a settled one. I changed the locks that week, not out of anger, but because it felt right to be the one holding the keys to something that had almost been taken without my knowledge. The district attorney's office ultimately offered my father a plea arrangement rather than pursuing a full trial, given his age, his lack of prior record, and the fact that full restitution had already been made through the civil settlement. He accepted a deferred judgment tied to probation and a formal record of fraud, meaning that while he avoided immediate jail time, the conviction would remain on record if he violated any terms during the probationary period. I attended the sentencing hearing sitting in the back row of a small courtroom that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee, and I watched him stand at a podium and read a short, clearly attorney-drafted statement about regretting the pain this process caused the family. He never once used the word forgery in that statement either. I noticed that, the way you notice a missing tooth in someone's smile, small but impossible to unsee once you've seen it. I still see my father occasionally at required legal proceedings, at a distance. We are not close. I don't know if we ever will be again, and I've made peace with that possibility. I no longer attend the family Christmas dinner, not because I was uninvited, but because I chose, for the first time in my life, not to attend a room where my presence had only ever been tolerated on the condition that I asked no questions. People sometimes ask me if this was about revenge. I don't think it was. Revenge is about making someone suffer to satisfy something in yourself. What I did was about documentation, not destruction. I never lied. I never forged anything. I never raised my voice in that conference room. I simply refused to let a false version of events stand uncorrected, and I let facts, dates, signatures, and bank records do the only kind of talking that could not be argued with or explained away over. A phone call about weather that never actually happened. There is a difference between wanting someone to hurt and refusing to let yourself be erased quietly for the comfort of people who never once protected you the same way. I chose the second one, and I would choose it again. This Christmas, I hosted a small dinner of my own, with Aunt Pauline, with Renee, with two friends who have quietly become more like family to me than some of my relatives ever were. We didn't have the good china. We had mismatched plates and too much food and a lot of laughter, and no one had to lie about the weather to keep anyone out. So here's my question for you, and I'd really like to know the answer in the comments below. Have you ever had to gather proof just to be believed inside your own family? And if you did, what was the moment you decided you weren't going to stay quiet anymore? I read every comment, so tell me where you're watching from, and if this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next video. I think often about the version of me who sat on that kitchen floor the night of the phone call, still in my work clothes, soup going cold on the stove behind me. I wish I could tell her it would be all right quickly, that the folder would come together easily, that the courthouse clerks would be kind and the document examiner would call back fast and the mediation would go smoothly. It didn't always feel smooth while I was living through it. There were nights I sat with the spreadsheet open until 2 a.m, cross-checking dates until my eyes blurred, wondering if I was overreacting the way my father had said I was. What kept me going wasn't anger. It was the memory of my grandmother's handwriting in that address book, small and careful, trying to protect something even as her own time was running out. I decided I owed it to her, and honestly, to myself, to finish what she started and never got the chance to see through. That's really the heart of this whole story, if I'm being honest with you. It was never about a Christmas dinner. The dinner was just the moment the lie became too small and too obvious to ignore any longer. The loose thread that, once I pulled it, unraveled everything they had been hoping I would never bother to check. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real people, families, or events is purely coincidental, and it's intended for entertainment and storytelling purposes only.